Please take a second to subscribe, then like and share afterwards. We can really use your support. Thank you. Woe to those who call evil good and good evil, who put darkness for light and light for darkness. Isaiah 5:20. Previously on Prophecies Uncovered, we wrapped up Hallowed Ground with a climactic conclusion on the September 11th saga. Now, we move into the present, where we stand as a nation and what God is implicating us for. Is it just for our sin in general, or being away from God? Well, partly yes, but there is a grave sin that is at the center of it all, and it all has to do with taking what is sacred and using it for non-sacred purposes. In ancient times, after the Babylonians took the Jewish people into exile, and along with them, they took the vessels from the Holy Temple and used them for the king's celebration. It is the principle of desacralization. These items were made and consecrated to God, and for the purposes of God. But then, Babylonians were using them against their purpose, as instruments of revelry and pagan worship, an abomination unto God. This is also known as desecration. This principle also happened in Israel as well, and here is the key. Once they began performing pagan rites with the temple to foreign gods and idols, judgment came. Now it's time to shift to America. What is it that became the equivalent to this desecration? When a nation that has known the ways of God falls away, it will take the things of God and use them against His purposes. It will take that which is holy and consecrated to the purposes of God and use it for what is not of God. America performed the ancient act, but it wasn't done to the sacred vessels of God's temple. The most important and sacred of God's vessels are not made of silver or gold, but rather they were fashioned by God's own hand on the days of creation. One of those sacred vessels is marriage. Marriage was created and consecrated for the purposes of God, a sacred vessel. It has been the foundation stone of civilization since the beginning of history, since the very day that God created Eve and brought her to Adam as the perfect companion and wife for him. But then, on June 26th, 2015, America broke the sacred vessel. Just as the Babylonians took the sacred vessels and used them for no real or intrinsic meaning, purpose, value, or sanctity, it is the very act of desecration, and this manifests only when a civilization has fallen. The same applies to marriage, human life, or existence itself. To fall away from God is to fall away from purpose and, ultimately, from life itself. What happened on that day in 2015? The Supreme Court made same-sex marriage a right nationwide, which ultimately meant it was no longer a sacred institution in the eyes of the entire country. Desecration. And it wasn't just about marriage. It was also about a divorcing of man from manhood and woman from womanhood. The ramifications of this national act would begin pouring into every fabric of the nation's culture, like a colored light spilling out from a broken, holy vessel. In fact, the breaking of that vessel that day in June caused celebrations throughout the nation and around the world. Celebrations were marked by a sign, a sign of many colors, the rainbow. The rainbow, 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 It appeared on flags and banners, on signs, and even on people. They took it to be a sign of their movement. But the rainbow doesn't belong to fallen man. It belongs to God. The rainbow is the sign that God Himself gave and consecrated after the global flood as a covenant with His creation. Like marriage, the rainbow is a sacred vessel, and so on that day it too was taken from its sacred purpose and desacralized. All these things centered on the Supreme Court. On the day when God's vessels were desecrated in Babylon, a sign appeared on the walls of the king's palace. And on the day that the vessel of God was desecrated in America, a sign would also appear on the wall of the king's palace. The palace is the White House. President Obama had the walls of the White House illuminated with the colors of the rainbow. That meant that the highest house in the land was now desecrated. The sign of desecration was seen by the entire nation and the entire world. The rainbow, as we need to understand, is connected to the throne of God. The book of Ezekiel speaks of the glory of God appearing in the likeness of the rainbow. The book of Revelation speaks of a rainbow surrounding God's throne. And now, the same sign, the sign of God's throne, His sovereignty and authority, was used against the authority of God. And on the walls of the king's palace, the throne of man at war with the throne of God. And what else is the rainbow connected to? Judgment. The rainbow was born into this world in judgment, a sign to Noah, showing God's mercy in the wake of judgment, a sign to hold back His wrath from happening. But what happens when the rainbow is used against God? When you turn the sign of God's mercy against its purpose and break it, what's left? Mercy is broken. Judgment returns. When the handwriting on the wall appeared in Babylon, it was the sign that judgment had been sealed. Then, less than 40 days after the sign on the White House appeared, another building was illuminated. It was the Empire State Building, but not with the rainbow, but rather with the image of the God of death and destruction, appearing over the skyline of New York City for all to see. Now it's time to shift to the next abomination, and it all starts with a word spoken through the book of Jeremiah. For the children of Judah have done evil in my sight, says the Lord. They have built the high places of Tophet, which is in the valley of the son of Hinnom, to burn their sons and their daughters in the fire. Tophet was the place where they killed their own children. It is revealed that it was required in the worship of their new gods after they turned from the true living God. They offered up their children as sacrifices, believing that they would obtain favor, increase, and gain. Tophet would represent the depth of Israel's fall from God. It was part of their progression. But then, for the blood of its most innocent, the nation would stand in judgment. America would follow that template of Israel's descent into the same evil, because it lost its purpose and values. Life lost its sanctity. Therefore, life became disposable. In 1973, the Supreme Court legalized abortion and thus opened the door to the utter darkness. But it didn't begin there. It began in 1970 in the House of Faces. It was here in those chambers that the first law to sanction the killing of unborn children took place. Soon, New York began drawing more and more women from across the country to abort their pregnancy. Soon, it became the Mecca for abortions. The modern-day American Tophet would be New York City. Now, interestingly, 1970 was also the very year that the first tower of the World Trade Center was completed. The same hand that signed the paper to begin the rise of those towers was the same hand that signed the paper that began the killing of children on demand. And what year was it that both towers were completed? 1973, the very year that the Supreme Court ruled in legalizing abortion through the Roe v. Wade case that shocked the nation with this landmark decision. So it all came together, the towers and the darkness. The two were joined from the beginning, one marking the other. The prophet Jeremiah spoke of the high places of Tophet. It was there that they built the high places. So, if New York City is the Tophet of America, then it must also be where the high places are built. The Twin Towers. The same city and in the same time frame, 1970 to 1973. And just as Tophet had an image of the gods they sacrificed to, so too with New York City. It was the image of Kali, the goddess of death, dripping blood over America's city of death. And just like the beginning of the abortion movement all began in the New York State Capitol building, or the House of Faces, so too did the beginning of the Twin Towers. It was here that they approved the plans for the towers, the same time and the same house. But then, in the same house, the law that passed abortion into practice was actually expanded here again in 2019 to be practiced in every direction throughout the country. It sparked a major controversy. Many disagreed with the motion, yet it picked up momentum. Despite the denials of the officials behind it, the law legalized the killing of children up to the point of birth. The line between the two ancient acts, abortion and infanticide, began to fade. And when the law passed inside that chamber, all the members who supported it all stood up and cheered. They celebrated it like it was the greatest day in history. The date was January 22nd, the very same day the Supreme Court made it legal to kill babies a half-century earlier. Now please remember this date, January 22nd, which we'll get to in the next episode. A bloody and gruesome law was passed, and yet the mystery continued. It was once again joined together with the tower. On that day, the governor of New York ordered the Freedom Tower at Ground Zero to be lit up in a bright color to celebrate the act. It was another sign of prophetic warning. What color was it? It was pink. It is a color associated with women, and also a color associated with babies. That's right, pure demonic. Just like what drove Israel to do such things could only be described as demonic. In fact, if you look closely at a carving into the stone wall at the House of Faces building, you can actually see a face of a creature lurking in the shadows of an opening in the stone. Now, in conclusion, Jeremiah was not only condemning the nation's murder of its children, he was prophesying judgment. He was foretelling the calamity and death that would come to Tophet and the nation. So, does this mean that calamity and death will come to today's Tophet? New York City and America? Well, incredibly, at the time of preparing this episode, on May 2nd, a leaked draft by a Supreme Justice suggested that the Supreme Court is prepared to overturn Roe v. Wade in a pending final decision that is expected to be held in June, just 1 month away. This will play a crucial role in this entire story. I believe and trust that the Church has been praying earnestly and without cessation over this matter of abortion across the nation, and this may be the very basis or cause for this changing tide. But it isn't over. Next month, we will reach the final decision on this matter. It will not end with the Supreme Court, but it is necessary to start there. We, as the Church of Christ, must continue to pray even harder, with fervor, with devotion, and with our hearts in the right place, not only to save countless children from death, but just as importantly, in the hopes that God's judgment can be abated, or better yet, be withdrawn. But it's going to be more than just an overturning on this decision. It's going to take a big cultural and spiritual shift across the country. And that is what we need to pray for. Because if that doesn't happen, then judgment will be just around the corner. Up next, we arrive to a dreadful time of shaking, foretold in the Old Testament. It is a mystery so critical that it brought America and the world to a near standstill. Here on Prophecies Uncovered.